The seven deadly sins are often treated as moral warnings, a spiritual guide to human weakness. But beneath the religious framework, there's a psychological story, one about the ways our basic drives can twist, distort, and consume us. Each sin begins as something ordinary, even necessary. Pride, hunger, desire, rest, these are not inherently evil. But unchecked, they can transform into forces that control our behavior, damage relationships, and erode our sense of self. Let's break them down one by one. Pride. Pride is usually described as the root of all sin, and psychology backs this up in surprising ways. At its core, pride is linked to self-esteem, our need to feel worthy, respected, and valued. Healthy pride gives us motivation, confidence, and resilience. But inflated pride, the kind we might call arrogance or narcissism, becomes dangerous. Psychologists find that people with narcissistic tendencies are often fragile beneath the surface. They depend heavily on external validation, needing others to constantly admire them. This fragile pride resists criticism and refuses to admit mistakes. Instead of building connection, it builds walls. Pride in this sense isn't just self-love, it's self-delusion, greed. Greed is often pictured as hoarding wealth, but psychology shows it's about much more than money. Greed is an addiction to control, security, and more. Our brains are wired for reward. Dopamine spikes when we gain something new. But greed hijacks this system, leaving us stuck in a cycle where enough never exists. Psychologists link this to what's called scarcity thinking, a belief that resources are always limited, and if you don't take them, someone else will. Underneath greed is often fear of loss, fear of powerlessness, fear of not being safe. On the surface, it looks like ambition, but deep down, it's anxiety disguised as accumulation. Lust is one of the most basic human drives. Biologically, it ensures reproduction and survival of the species. But psychology reminds us that lust can serve other functions too. It can be a coping mechanism for loneliness, insecurity, or even power. When lust is healthy, it connects to intimacy and bonding. But when it becomes compulsive, it reduces people to objects of gratification. Studies in psychology link compulsive lust to reward seeking similar to addiction, the rush of novelty, the thrill of desire, the temporary escape from deeper needs. Lust in this sense isn't about love at all, it's about control, fantasy, and self-soothing. Envy. Envy is one of the most corrosive emotions. Psychologists describe it as a product of social comparison, something humans are wired to do. We measure ourselves against others as a way to understand our place in the world. But envy takes this comparison and turns it toxic. Instead of admiration, envy produces resentment. It makes another person's success feel like our failure. Research shows envy often highlights unacknowledged desires. When we envy someone's talent, beauty, or lifestyle, it points to something we secretly want for ourselves. Yet instead of motivating growth, envy poisons relationships and creates bitterness. It's a mirror that shows us what we crave, but in the most painful way. Gluttony. Gluttony isn't just overeating. It's overconsumption in any form, whether it's food, entertainment, or even scrolling endlessly on social media. From a psychological standpoint, gluttony is tied to impulsivity and difficulty regulating the brain's reward circuits. Often, gluttony appears not because of hunger, but because of stress, boredom, or emotional emptiness. Eating, binge-watching, or compulsively consuming becomes a way to temporarily soothe deeper discomforts. The problem is that the relief never lasts. Overconsumption fills the moment, but it rarely fills the need. Wrath. Wrath is raw emotion unleashed without control. But psychologists remind us that anger itself is not inherently bad. In fact, anger can be a healthy signal that a boundary has been crossed or something is unfair. The problem comes when anger transforms into wrath, sustained rage that seeks to destroy. Psychologists describe anger as a secondary emotion. It often masks something more vulnerable, like fear, shame, or hurt. But when people cannot process those softer feelings, they lash out with aggression. Wrath creates cycles. Adrenaline fuels more anger, and more anger fuels more adrenaline. It erodes trust, harms health, and isolates us. In the end, wrath punishes not only its target, but also the one who carries it. Sloth. Finally, there's sloth. It's often dismissed as laziness, but psychology paints a more complex picture. Sloth is not simply not doing, it's a paralysis that comes from hopelessness, avoidance, or lack of meaning. People who struggle with sloth often battle depression, anxiety, or fear of failure. The avoidance is protective. If you don't try, you can't fail. But over time, inactivity breeds guilt, which leads to more avoidance, creating a downward spiral. What looks like laziness is often pain in disguise. Conclusion: what unites all 7 sins is not that they are unnatural, but that they are exaggerated. Pride begins as self-esteem. Greed begins as security. Lust begins as attraction. Envy begins as aspiration. Gluttony begins as nourishment. Wrath begins as protection. Sloth begins as rest. The psychology of the 7 deadly sins shows us that our greatest vices are often just our greatest needs distorted. They are human drives left unbalanced, unchecked, and unexamined. And while religion framed them as moral dangers, psychology reframes them as warnings of imbalance in the human mind. The 7 deadly sins remind us that human weakness isn't about being broken, it's about being human. The real challenge is not to erase these impulses, but to understand them, manage them, and channel them toward growth instead of destruction.